It is wonderfly beautiful and amazingly complex. But where did life come from? How did we get here? Was the world created by God? Or is life simply a byproduct of a natural process? Evolution, the Grand Experiment is a provocative new series that stares unflinchingly into this mystery and asks the most important scientific question of our time. What is the truth about evolution? Have the courage to question. Experience the thrill of discovery. Be a part of the Grand Experiment. For thousands of years, most believed in a creation account, a spectacular event in which God spoke, creating stars and planets, animals and sea creatures, birds, plants, and human beings. In 1859, the scientific and religious establishments were rocked by a new theory, one with a twist. Charles Darwin proposed that all living things developed through an exceedingly slow process over millions of years naturally. He shockingly suggested that man was not created by God. Rather, man evolved from apes and other lower animals. In his day, Darwin's book was a phenomenon which drew a firestorm of criticism. His theory created a conflict between those who believed in a six-day biblical creation and those who ascribed to this newly proposed, slow, natural evolution. Now, 150 years later, evolution is the dominant theory for the origin of life in most scientific and academic circles. Many scientists are concerned that the public has not embraced the theory of evolution. Gallup polls have repeatedly shown that most Americans do not believe that life formed naturally over millions of years. Rather, they still believe that God created the world and reject any theory that is not based on supernatural explanation.
I believe that something had to put us where we are. It's too big, it's too universal for us to just like evolve from one cell.
Did we come from monkeys? I don't know. There's evidence for it, but then there's also some stuff missing. So, making that leap between, with a missing link there. And I have some problems with it.
Only 13% of Americans believe in the purely mechanistic theory of evolution, that humans evolved from apes, and God had no part in the process.
Yes, I do believe in the theory of evolution, because I figure we had to come from someplace and, from ape to man to where we are today. Yes, I do. I definitely believe in evolution.
Do most reject evolution because the theory is implausible? Do they not believe because of their religious views? Or is it because they are unfamiliar with the theory? Darwin's evolution theory remains a divisive issue, but this conflict is nothing new. Even before Darwin, there were other natural explanations for the origin of life that conflicted with the biblical story of creation. Prior to Charles Darwin, scientists had some rather strange ideas concerning how life began. They believed that living organisms came into being rapidly and spontaneously over a period of just a few weeks. The scientific community believed in spontaneous generation for 2,000 years. And it is a stark reminder that even a majority of scientists can be wrong. In his classic 17th century description of spontaneous generation, scientist Jan Baptist von Helmont suggested that mice came from dirty underwear.
Wanneer je een stuk gedragen ondergoed, if you put a piece of sweaty underwear in an open-mouthed jar, together with a piece of wheat, after 21 days the ferment coming out of the underwear changed the wheat into mice. But what is even more amazing is that the mice are not small or aborted mice, but adult mice emerge.
Another evidence offered for spontaneous generation was the rotting meat experiment. 17th century scientists observed that if meat was placed in an open jar, maggots formed on the meat weeks later. They conjectured that life, in the form of maggots, arose spontaneously from rotting meat. But in 1668, Francesco Redi, an Italian physician and scientist, overturned this idea. He suggested this proof of spontaneous generation was nothing more than contamination of the meat by flies. When flies landed on the rotting meat, they laid their eggs. Over time, these eggs grew into maggots. Later, the maggots changed into flies. When scientist Redi prevented flies from landing on the meat with a piece of cheesecloth, maggots never formed. A third evidence for spontaneous generation was the 19th century pond water experiment. Scientists took pond water, boiled it, and poured it into an open jar. After a few weeks, the sterilized water was now teeming with bacteria. Soon the water became cloudy. Scientists suggested this was proof of spontaneous generation, that bacteria arose spontaneously from the sterile water. They scoffed at anyone who dared to question their conclusions. In 1859, spontaneous generation was finally rejected after the French Academy of Sciences held a contest to see if anyone could definitively prove or disprove the theory. Scientist Louis Pasteur stepped forward. Pasteur theorized that cloudy water did not represent spontaneous generation, rather contamination. He suggested that bacteria in the air seeded the water in the jar. To prove this, he sterilized water in an S-shaped glass. The opened end of the glass pointed upward and allowed air in, but bacteria could only settle in the neck and were prevented from reaching the water. After months of waiting, the liquid in the flask never became cloudy. With this experiment, Pasteur disproved spontaneous generation once and for all, and this first scientific natural explanation for the origin of life collapsed. Today, we can learn from the failures of the past. A scientific idea, theory, or law may be believed for thousands of years by a majority of scientists, only to be proven wrong. All scientific theories and laws should be open to scrutiny, even the theory of evolution.
It's not science unless you can question and falsify it. Unless you can say this is false, this is wrong, it's not science.
You know, scientists are just as much prone to holding on to old ideas as anyone else, and many of them are very conservative.
But there's always a chance with new evidence that we may find that there's a fundamental error in our thinking. You know, no scientist ever says never, and no good scientist ever says always.
It comes down to what you bring to the questions to begin with. If you don't want to see things, you're not going to see them. And we're all guilty of not wanting to see certain things.
Another scientific theory born around the time of Aristotle was the law of use and disuse, also called the law of acquired characteristics. Scientists thought that animals could change themselves through effort, and these changes would be passed on to the next generation. Darwin used this law to explain evolution. He believed a species could improve itself through effort, that if an animal exercised and developed large muscles, its offspring would ultimately be born with larger muscles. This idea is not true. Even if you exercised your body every day and developed enormous muscles, your child would not be born brawny. Muscle building has no effect on the DNA of the reproductive cells and cannot be passed on to the next generation.
Well, actually, of course, Lamarck and Darwin knew nothing about genes or genetics at all. It wasn't invented till long after. They understood heredity, but not genetics. But they didn't understand what the mechanisms of. In fact, they went down some wrong paths on that part. But that's okay. That's it was reasonable at the time for them to think that.
Darwin also thought that if an animal did not use a body part, such as a leg or an eye, its offspring would eventually be born without these. He envisioned animals shedding body parts this way through the law of disuse. For example, he suggested that the eyes of a mole became covered with fur and smaller because the mole did not use them underground, but this idea is genetically impossible. Using or not using a body part has no effect on the DNA of the reproductive cells and cannot be passed on to the next generation. If you put an eye patch on a baby at birth and left it there till adulthood, that person's offspring would still be born with normal eyes. Disuse of a body part has no effect on the next generation. In the late 19th century, a scientist with a vivid imagination and a butcher knife put the law of disuse to rest and caused an enormous difficulty for Darwin's theory.
A man by the name of August Weismann devised a simple experiment in which he kept cutting off the tails of mice, and he did this for 20-odd generations, and the mice still had tails.
With this simple experiment, the law of disuse was invalidated. Scientists continued to explore the law of use and later realized that this concept was also genetically impossible. Any change to body cells has no effect on the DNA in the reproductive cells and therefore cannot be passed on to the next generation.
The impact of that experiment and of other skeptical biologists essentially left an explanation for evolution sort of up in the air. And biologists were, although many of them felt that there weren't changes among organisms, they still felt that there was no adequate explanation to explain these changes.
Unfortunately, much of the public believes the law of use and disuse is a valid idea, partly because scientists occasionally describe the mechanism for evolution in these terms. Charles Darwin suggested that an individual animal could adapt to the environment, but surprisingly, this concept is now considered outdated. For example, a lizard could not grow fur simply because of a sudden cooling of the climate. Even if a skin cell could grow a hair, there's no way for the skin cell to pass this information to the reproductive cells. The reproductive cells, such as the eggs, cannot get signals from the outside environment or signals from the body cells. Because of these difficulties, some biologists have suggested eliminating the concept of direct adaptation altogether. Unfortunately, some naturalists and even university professors still speak in terms of these disproved and outdated mechanisms.
The outside environment is changing, therefore the organism has to adjust to those changes if he wants to survive. And even your DNA is getting signals, your DNA in your egg is getting signals from the outside. And those signals are being translated through stress in your body.
This statement is biologically impossible. There is no way to signal the DNA in the reproductive cells as this scientist suggests. Sometimes when one group of scientists disproves a concept, other scientists continue to promote these false ideas for decades, if not centuries. Darwin suggested that the survival of the fittest, or natural selection, was another mechanism for evolution. He thought that nature would favor the strongest varieties within any species, and the weakest would eventually die off. The surviving varieties would improve over time, and eventually evolve into a completely new species. Some scientists argue that natural selection does not have the power or capacity to theoretically cause evolution. They contend that this process can only select or remove traits for a species, but not create new body parts. To better understand their argument against natural selection, one has to go no further than an animal breeder, who uses the process called artificial selection. Artificial selection mimics natural selection, but instead of nature making the reproductive choices, a breeder makes the decisions, consciously. In both processes, there is a limit to how much can be accomplished by breeding. For instance, dogs have a limited number of genes or variations coded in its DNA, such as color, shape, or size. Using artificial selection, a breeder cannot go beyond these limits. Breeders have created a 4-inch tall Chihuahua and a 3.5-foot tall Great Dane, but they cannot produce a 10-foot tall dog or a 1-inch dog. Breeders can select for dogs with short hair or long hair, but they cannot produce a dog with feathers. Natural selection and artificial selection can only promote characteristics that are already present in an animal's gene pool, but cannot add completely new genes or body parts to any animal species. Scientists who support evolution have recognized this limitation of natural selection. Now there is a new theory of evolution to explain how animals could theoretically develop new body parts, such as wings or eyes or feathers. The new theory of evolution, called Neo-Darwinian evolution, suggests that animals did not evolve by effort, need, or as a direct response to the environment as Darwin thought. Rather, mutations in the genes of the reproductive cells would cause one animal to slowly change over time into another. This new theory of evolution suggests that a carnivorous land mammal became a whale by accidental mutations.
In trying to understand the evolution of whales and dolphins from four-legged terrestrial carnivores, the first thing you have to keep in mind is that chance plays a tremendous role in this.
Scientists who oppose evolution suggest that changing one animal into another by accidental mutations is preposterous. If a carnivorous land mammal, such as a hyena, evolved into a whale, too many body transitions would have to occur by chance. The hyena's front legs would have to change into pectoral fins. Its back legs would have to disappear. Its nostrils would have to move to the top of its head and form a blowhole. The hyena would have to develop a dorsal fin by accident. Its bony tail would have to change into a cartilaginous fluke. The hyena's hair would have to nearly disappear and be replaced by blubber. Its body would have to increase to 80,000 pounds, and its external ears would have to disappear and change for high-pressure diving. Each of these new traits would require at least one new structural protein. Each protein would in turn necessitate adding 300 letters of DNA to the genetic blueprint in the proper sequence. This would be equivalent to a blindfolded toddler typing several pages of meaningful paragraphs into a completed book, or to a person throwing a die thousands of times in a row, and each time it came up as 3. Given these improbable odds of evolution occurring through accidental mutations, some scientists are now questioning the theory of evolution.
The first essentially complete adult skull.
Scientists who support evolution suggests humans evolved from apes because apes and humans have many similar features, such as the number of bones in the arms and legs. They also believe that birds evolved from dinosaurs because of similar features in the skeletons. The modern theory of evolution is based on this concept of similarities. According to the theory, the greater the number of features two animals share, the more closely they are related to each other. Moles present a dilemma for this line of reasoning. Moles have rudimentary eyes, soft, thick fur, short legs, broad feet, and long claws. Australian and African moles look nearly identical, but evolution scientists believe they are unrelated because the Australian marsupial mole has a pouch and the African mole does not. There are other sets of animals that fall into this same category. Dolphins and sharks look similar, but are not closely related. One is a mammal and one is a fish, yet they both have dorsal fins, pectoral fins, and a finned tail. Australian pouched marsupial mice look nearly identical to North American mice, but the theory of evolution considers them unrelated. In each of these cases, great numbers of similar features are ignored, making similarities an unreliable indicator that evolution occurred. Darwin thought animals slowly changed from one basic type into a completely different type over millions of years, such as a dinosaur changing into a bird, or an invertebrate changing into a fish. But instead of seeing evidence for evolution in the fossils, Darwin saw gaps between animal groups. The fossils did not show one animal group slowly changing into another as his theory predicted. The expected transitional forms or links were missing.
Darwin devotes 2 chapters of the origin to the fossil record, And you might think that's because Darwin, like most of his intellectual descendants, would have seen the fossil record as the confirmation of his theory, that you could really see, directly document the evolution of life from the Cambrian to the present. But in fact, when you read The Origin, it turns out that Darwin's 2 chapters are a carefully worded apology in which he argues that natural selection is correct, despite the fact that fossils don't particularly support it.
Darwin attributed this lack of evidence for his theory to the poor fossil collections in his day. He believed his theory would be vindicated once more fossils were found. Since Darwin's time, the British Natural History Museum in London has collected 9 million fossils. Fossils now offer an enormous opportunity to test the theory of evolution.
There are about 9 million fossils in the collections. The whole of the building from one end to the other is about a quarter of a mile long.
Over 200 million fossils have been collected by museums worldwide, many of which are exquisitely detailed. Even the most minute and delicate plants and animals have been recovered, including fossilized bacteria, worms, and flowers. 100 million animals without backbones, such as snails, sea pens, scallops, starfish, and crustaceans, have been assembled, including over 1 million fossil insects. The fossilized collections of vertebrates, animals with backbones, are even more staggering. 4,000 fossil whales have been collected, 200,000 fossil birds, and 500,000 fish. Some of these are complete specimens and not just fossil pieces. Scientists suggest the fossil record is remarkably comprehensive, balanced, and representative of the past.
We have 250,000 different fossil species in our museums today. If evolution is true, tens of thousands of these should be of undoubted transitional form, showing invertebrates becoming fishes, showing the fins of a fish changing the feet and legs of an amphibian, showing forelimbs gradually becoming wings and scales becoming feathers and apes changing into people. We should enormous number of these transitional forms. That's what we must find if evolution is true.
With this enormous fossil collection, the world can now test the validity of evolution. Does the fossil record show animals changing over time, as Darwin predicted?
Within those first fishes, we get
Scientist John Long is one of Australia's most eminent paleontologists and is the head of science at the prestigious Museum Victoria in Melbourne. He has studied fossil fish for years. He reports that the fossil fish collections of the world are immense.
How many fossil fish are there in museums? Well, I visited some of the biggest museums in the world to study their fossil fish collections, such as the Natural History Museum in London and the American Museum of Natural History. And I'd say conservatively there'd be hundreds of thousands, probably maybe up to 500,000.
Although fish have the most abundant fossil record of all the vertebrates, there are no fossils showing invertebrates, such as jellyfish or starfish, slowly changing into fish. Nor do the fossils show the formation of a spinal cord over time, as Darwin predicted.
There's a lot of debate over the origins and diversity of the first jawed fishes, the gnathostomes as we call them. That's still one of the great mysteries and problems to be solved in vertebrate evolution.
Despite a 150-year search for evolutionary ancestors, every fish family appears suddenly in the fossil record.
Every major kind of fish that we know anything about appears fully formed. There's not a trace of an ancestor for any of these creatures, and there are no transitional forms suggesting that these major kind of fishes evolved from a common ancestor. Now, evolutionists know that. They say it is true, but they believe in evolution anyhow. But evolution is impossible. The origin of fishes, that's the origin of vertebrates. That would be the most astounding, important event in all of evolutionary history. We should have book after book after book written about the origin of vertebrates. We should have picture after picture of all of these transitional forms. There's nothing. The fact that the vertebrates, the fishes, appear fully formed, no trace of ancestors, no trace of transitional form, destroys the theory of evolution. Evolution cannot be true.
Scientists who support evolution still hold out hope that they will eventually find these fossils.
The evolution of fish is still very much debated amongst paleontologists, and I think that within the next 10 years we'll probably get some resolution on the origin and interrelationships of the major groups of fishes. All we really know at the moment is that the bony fishes came from one of these primitive groups, but we don't really know which one. So there's still mystery and some debate over where the true bony fishes came from.
Scientists who oppose evolution suggest the absence of fish ancestors in the presence of 500,000 fossil fish speaks resoundingly against evolution. Bats are warm-blooded flying mammals. Some bats use sonar-like echolocation to catch their prey. An amazing 1,000 fossil bats have been collected so far. Many of these are complete bats. Some show breathtaking minute detail, such as wing membranes, fur, and even stomach contents. Despite this rich fossil record, Darwin's predicted intermediates have not been found. There are no fossils showing a ground mammal similar to a mouse slowly changing into a flying mammal, a bat.
You would guess that there'd be some sort of a bat precursor, but once again, nothing. Bingo, they just show up. And so, as you might guess, that there are certain people that think they were specially created. They actually are kind of a problem with the creationists who like to, if things were created, here's a very highly complex mammal with all these adaptations, and bingo, they just show up at some particular moment in time fully formed as a bat. Obviously, we evolutionary biologists and paleontologists don't believe that, but at this point we don't have a good fossil ancestor for them.
When did bats evolve from the land mammals? When is it theorized?
Well, that must have happened also in the lowest tertiary, but we have no evidence for this evolution. Also, the bats appear perfectly developed.
We don't have any non-flying bats, and so we can't pull something out of that, any kind of information out of that tells us how they might have evolved.
What period of time did the bats evolve, do we think?
We have no fossil records of bats during the Cretaceous period, and this means that we are only depending on speculation when it started and what happened in that time. Of course, when we have the oldest bats, like Icaronicteris, they were completely developed in their morphology and their flight apparatus, and also the messel bats were completely developed. So we can only speculate.
Opponents of evolution have seized on this lack of evolutionary intermediates in the fossil record. They ask, how many more bats would have to be collected before one declares the absence of ancestors a reality? For them, the fossil evidence of bats clearly speaks against evolution. Watching sea lions frolicking on a beach is a beautiful sight indeed. Sea lions walk using their flippers and have visible external ears. They can hold their breath for 15 minutes and can swim an amazing 25 miles per hour. They can dive hundreds of feet deep. But where did these aquatic mammals come from? Australian paleontologists who support evolution believe that sea lions evolved from a dog-like animal. American paleontologists believe sea lions evolved from a bear-like animal. Although the fossil record of sea lions is abundant, fossils of transitional animals have not been found. Seals are often mistaken for sea lions, but they are an entirely different family of mammals. Unlike sea lions, seals move on the ground like a caterpillar in an undulating pattern. Also, seals do not have visible ears. Evolution scientists believe seals evolved from the skunk and otter family.
Phosid seals are allied to a completely separate group of carnivores, the mustelids, the skunks and otters.
Over 5,000 fossil seals have been identified, but all of the predicted evolutionary ancestors are missing.
We don't have such a material. We already can say this is true seals according to morphology of the bones. We cannot say, I don't know what is this, it has so many features. And it's not a time where we can find this missing link.
According to opponents of evolution, finding 5,000 fossil seals without evolutionary ancestors contradicts the theory of evolution. The idea of dinosaurs roaming our planet seems almost imaginary, but evidence of their existence is undeniable. Some of the plant-eating dinosaurs were over 90 feet long and weighed 30 tons. Meat-eating dinosaurs had huge serrated teeth and powerful jaws that could rip apart any foe. Paleontologists have recovered 3,000 dinosaur skeletons, plus bones and teeth from 100,000 dinosaurs. The remains are so voluminous they cannot all be displayed, many being relegated to museum basements. Despite this enormous collection of remains, no ancestors have been found for any dinosaur species, even Tyrannosaurus rex.
Wherever we try to put tyrannosaurs in the phylogeny of the branching history of theropod dinosaurs, they have a long missing record. And we're going to find that record one of these days.
We're certainly lacking information that ties together meat-eating dinosaurs and all the rest of the dinosaurs.
Even the plant-eating ornithischian dinosaurs have this same fossil pattern. A plethora of fossils, but no direct ancestors.
We haven't really any idea how the whole other group of dinosaurs called ornithischians, exactly the timing of and the way they branched off. We've got nothing there yet. It's a huge gap.
Despite finding hundreds of skulls for the plant-eating dinosaur Triceratops, no direct evolutionary ancestors have been found.
Triceratops heads are just pretty common. I've heard tell that there are at least 50 different individuals just based on skulls alone, and that's probably complete skulls. And who knows how many partial skulls would increase that number. I suspect we probably know, 100 or hundreds of Triceratops from their skulls.
Many dinosaur evolution charts, such as this one from the Chicago Field Museum, imply that the ancestors of dinosaurs have been discovered. But when the solid lines are overlaid with the actual number of dinosaurs found, the chart tells a very different story. Opponents of evolution suggest these museum diagrams are often misleading and do not reflect the fossil evidence. Whales are magnificent creatures, capable of holding their breath for over an hour and diving to over 1,000 feet deep. But where did they come from? Scientists who support evolution suggest whales evolved from a land mammal. For them, the fossil evidence is so convincing, the evolution of whales is offered as one of the best fossil proofs for the theory of evolution. However, scientists who oppose evolution argue that this fossil evidence is unreliable. Darwin thought that whales might have evolved from bears. In The Origin of Species, he wrote, "In North America, the black bear was seen swimming for hours with widely open mouth, thus catching, like a whale, insects in the water. I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered, by natural selection, more and more aquatic in their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale." Modern evolution scientists have abandoned Darwin's idea of a bear evolving into a whale. Scientists at the University of Michigan suggest whales evolved from this cat-like animal because of the similarities in the teeth, while scientists at the California Academy of Sciences believe this hyena-like animal evolved into a whale because its teeth are similar to some extinct whales. Biologists in Japan suggest whales evolved from a hippopotamus-like animal based on similarities in the DNA. Detractors of the theory ask, if whale evolution is so clear, and if the fossil record is so abundant, why can't evolution scientists agree upon which land mammal changed into a whale? There is great excitement in the scientific community over the discovery of a few important missing links between a land mammal and modern whales.
But what's good about these particular fossil whale specimens is that they do show us intermediates in the evolution of whales, and we don't often get fossil intermediates, so we can actually trace the development of characters. Say, for example, the evolution of swimming in whales. We don't often have that opportunity.
They have a big exhibit on it in Michigan. I was just there. They have all these things just sitting out there. I mean, they're all there. I mean, you really have to be blind or 3 days dead not to see the transition among these. You have to not want to see it.
As shown in this diagram from the University of Michigan Natural History Museum, Ambulocetus is one of the important transitional fossils in whale evolution. It is thought by some to be a walking whale.
Just in the last 5 or 10 years, we've had some remarkable discoveries of fossil whales. And in fact, there have been discoveries that have indicated that fossil whales had feet and actually walked on the land.
Frankly, I don't know why they could call that creature a whale. I have never seen a walking whale, and I've never seen a pig that flies. And they suggested some of these creatures were intermediate. Frankly, I just don't believe it. They believe that because they want to believe it.
Recently, some evolution scientists have backed off the assertion that Ambulocetus was an ancestor of modern whales because its eyes are high up on the head, like an alligator's eyes, quite dissimilar from whales and land mammals.
Ambulocetus may be on a slight sideline, and we think that mostly because it's very strange. It has its eyes raised up on top of its head in a very strange way, and it's unusually large for an early whale. But mostly the eyes up on the top of the head seems like an unusual specialization. Maybe it's not on the main line.
Evolution scientists claim the most spectacular intermediate fossil in whale evolution is Rhodocetus, an animal with 4 legs, a whale's tail called a fluke, and flippers. It would swim using its widened tail fluke like a modern whale, but it had 4 legs like a land mammal. A perfect transitional fossil between land mammals and aquatic mammals, just as Darwin predicted.
The fossil whale that appears a little bit later is Rhodocetus, and this animal had large tail vertebrae that indicate there were lots of room for muscle attachment. So here we see the beginning of the type of locomotion that's characteristic of the modern whale, using just the tail flukes for propulsion and not using the hind limbs.
We have a complete modern whale-type structure in Rhodocetus. There are not many modifications from Rhodocetus to the modern whale other than changes in size of the structures.
When this video series was being filmed on location at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, the executive producer noticed a discrepancy between museum drawings of Rhodocetus and the fossils. The reconstruction of Rhodocetus had a whale fluke, but there were no fossils of the tail to confirm this. Dr. Phil Gingrich, the scientist responsible for the discovery and reconstruction of Rhodocetus, was questioned how he knew there was a whale fluke on Rhodocetus, since that part of the fossil was missing.
What was the reasoning that the scientists think there was a fluke on Rhodocetus based on the other pieces of anatomy?
Well, I told you we don't have the tail in Rhodocetus, so we don't know for sure whether it had a ball vertebra indicating a fluke or not. So I speculated it might have had a fluke.
Scientist Gingrich also acknowledged that the flippers were drawn on the diagram without these fossils. Now, he does not believe this animal had flippers. Again, his answer was surprising, since the museum diagrams had flippers on Rhodocetus.
Now, since then, we've found the forelimbs, the hands, and the front arm, the arms, in other words, of Rhodocetus. And we understand that it doesn't have the kind of arms that can be spread out like flippers are on a whale. And if you don't have flippers, I don't think you can have a fluke tail in really powered swimming. And so I now doubt that Rhodocetus would have had a fluke tail.
Many experts consider whales to be the best fossil evidence for evolution, but are unaware of these discrepancies. Opponents of evolution contend that whale evolution is nothing more than hopeful supposition. If museum diagrams are redrawn and corrected for various discrepancies, opponents argue that whale evolution is non-existent. Birds are a diverse group of vertebrates. Most are able to defy gravity and fly. Some are able to swim underwater, while others are incapable of flying or swimming. Evolution scientists believe birds evolved from dinosaurs. They refer to the oldest known fossil bird, Archaeopteryx, as a missing link because of its unique mix of both bird and dinosaur-like features.
Archaeopteryx is a classical example of a connecting links between two high systematic categories, namely the classes of birds and reptiles. Its skeleton is still dinosaur-like, whereas it had already fully developed feathers as the extant birds, and obviously it was capable of powered flight. The existence of such connecting links, that means intermediate stages between large groups of organisms, is a conclusion of Darwin's theory of evolution. And the discovery of the first specimens of Archaeopteryx met the expectations of the Darwinians and had an enormous impact on the scientific community.
Opponents of evolution believe Archaeopteryx was simply a bird. Many museum models portray Archaeopteryx with a scaly dinosaur-like head. Dr. Peter Wellnhofer, one of the world's experts on the evolution of birds, believes these museum models are wrong because scales were not found on the fossils. He contends that Archaeopteryx had a feathered head.
So we can reconstruct a model of Archaeopteryx based on the dimensions of the skeleton and based on the extent of the wing, of the feathers, of the wing and tail. We don't have a record of the body covering of the head, for example. So reconstructions are in most or in large parts are hypothetical and speculative. What is not known is the covering of the head, whether it was scaly. It doesn't mean that the lack of feather imprints means that there were no feathers. It's well possible that finer feathers and short and more delicate feathers just were not preserved as fossils, as imprints. They were too soft, too tiny. And how far the feathers reached around the skull, we just don't know. Whether it was scaly like a lizard, we don't know, but I personally, I'm very suspicious that that was true. But as I said, this is all speculation.
Many models of Archaeopteryx highlight the wing claws, which are thought to be similar to claws on the arms of dinosaurs. Opponents of evolution argue that claws on the wings are not necessarily a dinosaur feature. Bats have wing claws, but bats are mammals and unrelated to dinosaurs. Also, many modern birds have claws on their wings.
But we have also other birds, a lot of birds, which display claws as nestlings. This is not so rare. This is amazing. Yeah? I think most people don't know this.
No birds living today have teeth, but Archaeopteryx did. This leads some scientists to think this animal descended from meat-eating dinosaurs. Scientists who disagree with evolution point out that teeth are present in all vertebrate groups, not just dinosaurs. Also, the teeth of Archaeopteryx do not have serrations like their theoretical ancestors, the theropod dinosaurs.
Tyrannosaurus rex, the teeth are serrated like a steak knife front and back, and that was really for ripping flesh. Whereas in Archaeopteryx, the teeth are pretty smooth on either edge, and if they have any serrations at all, they're very, very, very faint serrations.
Birds today have a very short tail called a pygostyle, yet the tail of Archaeopteryx is relatively long, which some believe to be another dinosaur trait. Opponents argue similarities such as the length of tail cannot be used as evidence for evolution, since many animals have long tails. Some museum models show Archaeopteryx in a dinosaur-like pose, using its wing claws to catch its prey. However, if the bones of Archaeopteryx are reassembled in a bird-like position, its skeleton takes on the appearance of a modern bird. And if the speculative scales are replaced with feathers, Archaeopteryx looks no more unique than other birds. Although scientists who support evolution believe Archaeopteryx evolved from a dinosaur, they have not found the fossils to prove this.
So we don't know exactly the dinosaurs from which the birds evolved. But there are so many features of birds which are dinosaur-like that most paleontologists think that they descend from these dinosaurs.
Opponents of evolution suggest that Archaeopteryx is a specialized bird, and without bird ancestors, the theory is essentially speculation. Some evolution scientists theorize that feathered dinosaurs existed in the past. In support of this belief, museums have added feathers to many common dinosaur models, such as this velociraptor exhibited at the Museum of Victoria in Australia. Opponents of evolution and even some evolution scientists have criticized this practice, since no feathers have been found with any dinosaur fossil. In an open letter to the National Geographic Society, Dr. Sturs Olsen, a Smithsonian Institute evolution scientist, has referred to the practice of adding feathers to dinosaurs as propaganda, hype, wishful thinking, melodramatic, nonsense, spurious, fantasia, and a hoax. He wrote, "The idea of feathered dinosaurs and the theropod origin of birds is being actively promulgated by a cadre of zealous scientists acting in concert with certain editors at Nature and National Geographic, who themselves have become outspoken and highly biased proselytizers of the faith. Truth and careful scientific weighing of evidence have been among the first casualties in their program, which is now fast becoming one of the grander scientific hoaxes of our age." This practice may not be the only scientific impropriety in the bird evolution evidence list. In the mid-1990s, a whole series of fossils with feathers were found in the Liaoning province of China. According to evolution scientists, the discovery of unique feathered fossils supports bird evolution. But reliability problems have emerged for these fossils. Dr. Timothy Rowe is a paleontologist who supports evolution and runs the University of Texas CAT scan laboratory. Dr. Rowe had the unique opportunity to closely examine a Chinese fossil called Confucius ornis, which, to the naked eye, appeared to be a solitary fossil.
I believe we scanned this in 1997. It was just shortly after the bonanza of Liaoning had hit the news in a big way. I'd never handled any of these specimens before. And this was brought to me, and I thought this was how it came out of the ground. And I thought, oh, what an awesome specimen. It's complete and massive and it's easy to handle. And only by scanning it did I learn, in fact, how it had been repaired.
But after scanning the fossil, Dr. Rowe began to question its authenticity.
And when I handled it, it was very well built. It felt like a single massive piece of rock. And only by looking at it in cross-section could I see that it was built in 3 layers, 2 of which were natural, and the intervening layer was made by humans. And so this really started me thinking, well, there's a little more here than meets the eye.
Grout and metal chips lay hidden inside the fossil, which became obvious when subjected to the scrutiny of the CAT scan. The fossil had been carefully painted to hide alterations.
But once we scanned it, we could see the grout layer. And so when we see steel objects in these things, we know that it's got to be made by humans.
Upon further evaluation, Dr. Rowe found a piece of the jaw had been substituted with a bone from another animal.
Well, I have no idea what animal this piece came from. It's just a very small fragment of bone, and it was probably chipped out to fit this space. So I have no idea where this extraneous piece came from. There are some other odd pieces around the edges too that don't fit on this.
This first encounter with a Chinese specimen would not be Dr. Rowe's last. A second Chinese fossil was brought to him by a scientist from National Geographic magazine. This fossil, called Archaeoraptor, was purported to be an unusual missing link which would, once and for all, prove that birds evolved from dinosaurs. It had a long featherless tail, similar to dinosaurs, but it also had feathers and a bird-like body, giving the appearance of two different animals blended together, just as Darwin predicted. As Dr. Rowe carefully scanned the Chinese specimen and watched the cross-sectional images appear on the computer screen, he noticed something was very wrong. Dr. Rowe discovered that 26 fossil bones from 5 animals, including a dinosaur and a bird, had been fraudulently constructed to make a transitional fossil.
And that was the thing that caught our attention first. We could find no verifiable fit between the tail, the most spectacular part of this specimen. We could find no verifiable fit between that piece and any of the other parts of the block. And we found other irregularities as well. Even though it seems to fit tightly in here, when you look at it in cross-section, you can see that this piece and this piece have no verifiable association with the pieces around them. The next thing happened where the 2 shin bones were glued in. And likewise, these have no verifiable associations. The next thing that happened is that the foot was glued on, and I say foot rather than feet because this is a single foot. This is a slab and counter slab that were split and separated and glued in place to make it look as though there were right and left feet there. It's a clever use of materials. You know, if you're limited, you take a single foot and turn it into 2, you know, very, very creative.
This schematic diagram shows how many different fossils and rocks were used to create Archaeoraptor. Each color represents a different type of rock and a different type of animal. Dr. Rowe reported his startling discoveries to the National Geographic scientist. Yet soon afterwards, the unexpected happened. National Geographic held a press conference announcing the discovery of Archaeoraptor, failing to disclose the fossil as a fraud.
And we provided the data and our interpretation to the representatives of Geographic, and the scientist in charge, as he walked out of the building, his last comment to me was, well, all of these Chinese things have been fiddled with. But he understood that there were profound questions surrounding this, and we'd been brought in as consultants simply to scan the specimen, and which we did. We presented our interpretation, original copies of the data to all parties, and it was a total shock when the news conference came that they were announcing that this was a valid specimen.
3 months after the original CAT scan was performed, National Geographic published its story about the discovery of Archaeoraptor. The article claimed that Archaeoraptor was a flying dinosaur, a missing link, and the best evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs, but failed to reveal the serious discrepancies found by Dr. Rowe. Those who oppose evolution suggest that if evolution scientists have to add scales to the heads of birds, add feathers to dinosaurs when neither had been found, or resort to creating fraudulent fossils as evidence for evolution, then there must be no proof. Scientists who support evolution acknowledge that individual scientists have made mistakes, but these are corrected over time. This is how science works. Many are still convinced birds evolved from dinosaurs. Many well-accepted scientific theories concerning a multitude of subjects have been disproved. Some thought the Earth was flat. Some thought the Sun orbited the Earth. Some thought life came from non-living things through spontaneous generation. Some thought animals could change themselves through use and disuse, and could pass these changes to the next generation. Scientists are just as prone to holding on to old ideas as anyone else. Knowing this list of historical scientific blunders, each perpetuated for more than 1,000 years, how many of us have scrutinized today's prevailing theory that humans evolved from a single-cell organism that mutated over millions of years? A theory is just that, a theory. We must always bear in mind that any scientific theory may be false and must be continuously subjected to testing. All of Darwin's proposed mechanisms for evolution have proved to be insufficient. Even the new theory, evolution by chance mutations, has its detractors. Darwin predicted his theory of evolution would eventually be proven in the fossil record. More than 200 million fossils have been recovered. Did his prediction come true? Or does the lack of transitional forms between animal groups in the face of an enormous fossil record give you cause to question? Thousands of fossil seals and sea lions have been found, but no ancestors. 1,000 bats have been discovered, but there are no ancestors. Despite recovering fossils from 100,000 dinosaurs, there are no intermediate forms of these species. Do you agree with modern evolution scientists that evolution is the most reliable scientific theory that best explains the fossils and life itself? What is the truth about evolution? What do you think?